Troops have served in the African Union peacekeeping mission in Somalia for 15 years. Last week, Al-Shabaab fighters attacked their base in Bula Maria in the Lower Shabelle region. The Ugandan government took days to confirm the number of deaths.
Al-Shabaab claimed they've killed over 130 Ugandan peacekeepers in that incident. The Ugandan military did admit casualties, they did suffer casualties, but did not reveal the number until today, in which they claim 54 were killed.
The Somali government has been making gains against the armed group for months. It's taken back swathes of territory and encouraged Somalis to work with the government to reveal Al-Shabaab hideouts. But it appears the armed group is still capable of launching a large-scale attack against an African Union base.
Despite gaining territory from Al-Shabaab, Al-Shabaab is still able to strike targets at will, whether it be Somali government installations or foreign military bases, as you've seen with the latest incident targeting the Ugandan military base.
Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni says his soldiers did not perform as expected and panicked. Museveni had threatened to reduce the number of troops serving in the African Union mission after funding cuts in 2020. There's also pressure at home to end the mission in Somalia. And now, after last week's raid, 2 senior officers are facing a court-martial to answer for one of the largest number of Ugandan deaths in a single attack in Somalia. Barbara Angopa, Al Jazeera.
Laminu would drive men and women across the desert to Libya. At one point, they came across an absolutely nightmarish scene. There was a vehicle that had hit a mine and had been completely obliterated, and the bodies of more than a dozen migrants scattered around the vehicle. My name's Nicole Sabeki. I'm a photographer based in Nairobi, Kenya, where I've been for the last 10 years. I came to Libya a little less than a week after the uprisings had begun. I was essentially sleeping wherever I could find and then spending my days with the rebel forces. This first image is a photo of a protest happening outside of the courthouse in Benghazi. The government had been removed from the city at this point. It was being run by the civilian government. And these protests, they really felt like an opportunity to vent after so many years of silence and to show support for the government in waiting that was being forged behind these walls. This is an image of 2 rebel fighters outside the Ras Lanuf oil refinery. There's something about this image that always feels very theatrical to me. Like they're almost performing the role of rebel fighter. So you have people in sort of mismatched military garb, but also just this long trench coat, jeans, sneakers. You know, most of them were not trained fighters. These were engineers, civilians, students, bakers who had come together through their shared goal of defeating Gaddafi. This image was taken from a vehicle that had been hit by an airstrike, killing 1 man. Rebel forces in this area had rushed to the scene. Volunteers had taken his body away in an ambulance. They were pulling personal artifacts from the car, a bloody shoe, a broken mirror. Men were cursing Gaddafi, praying. Some of them were weeping. It's hard to describe how vulnerable it felt to be out in the desert. There's no cover. There's nowhere to hide. This felt like a very emotional.
Last week marked the first anniversary of the war in Sudan. The death toll there is in the tens of thousands. But it is in the number of people displaced, nearly 9 million, and in need of humanitarian aid, around 25 million, that this story really stands out. A conflict on this scale should top the news agenda, but it has been relegated to the back pages, in part because of what is happening in Gaza and Ukraine. And it is increasingly difficult to deny that the lack of media interest in this war comes down to where it is being fought and how it is understood. Then there's the framing that this is a war between 2 generals, men in uniform, which obfuscates the role of global players in the fighting and creates the perception that there are only 2 choices available. It is a binary that implicitly excludes a third option, one that civil society in Sudan has been fighting for decades: democracy.
You know, what is the state of Africa as I speak now? What is the state of your continent as we speak now? Because of our disunity. Because when we are disunited, then it is good for Europe and America. And China progressively. Look at the state of your continent as I speak. Conflicts of one kind or another. I'll name the countries just for you to know how bad it is, because that is how it is. Go to northern Mozambique. The gas that is there cannot be produced because there is conflict. Northern Mozambique. Go to Somalia. Conflict. Here in your motherland, conflict. Go to South Sudan, conflict. Go to Sudan, conflict. Go to Libya, conflict. Go to Central African Republic, conflict. Go to the Democratic Republic of Congo, conflict. Go to Burkina Faso, conflict. Go to Mali, conflict. Go to Chad, conflict. Go to Niger, conflict. Go to Cameroon, conflict. Go to Nigeria, conflict. Do I go on? That is the state of the continent. So that even when we talk about intercontinental trade, you tell me, can you drive from Addis Ababa to Dakar in Senegal? Unless you are Daredevil himself. Which group will not kidnap or ambush you? That is the state of the continent because we are weak and disunited. I fly from Nairobi, Kenya for 1.5 hours. I come from the shilling zone. I go into the birr. 33 currencies in Africa. 33 currencies. None of which is used to conclude transactions anywhere. I come to Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, and I show my shilling. They say, what is this? But let me show the dollar. Oh, this is it. Let me show the euro. This is it. 80% of transactions in Africa are concluded outside of the continent in dollars. So you may have the Central Bank or the Federal Bank of Ethiopia, or Mickey Mouse. You may have the Central Bank of Kenya, Mickey Mouse. You may have all these 54 central banks useless. Because we are not playing in the real league, we are playing in the small league. That is why when the Chinese president summons all our presidents, and they summon them, the letters may be polite, but it's summons. They go to Beijing, tails between their legs, and they are told. Then the Chinese president gives Africa $60 billion. $60 billion. What is $60 billion? George Bezos has more than that given to a whole continent. That is the state of the continent. So as you have the honor and privilege of serving in the government of Ethiopia, and as you think about integration, that is the continent in which you are now, weak.
Now, hello guys, I do hope and pray that you are fine wherever you are. It is around 7, let me say almost 7 p.m. in Kenya, and I am about to leave to somewhere, and I said that I should just record this video before I leave. I wanted to talk about something which is ongoing in Africa, and for those who follow this platform, I hope you are now aware that I have always insisted on the need for African countries and African presidents to assess the kind of wars that they fight and they engage in. I gave various examples of African countries which are currently at war, and I insistently said that these African countries, most of them, are fighting wars which are not of their own making. Africans mainly are fighting wars which emanate from the West. I did give a discussion on this platform where I argued that most of the wars which are currently fought in Africa are based on, let me say, confrontations from these powerful countries. I gave an example of DR Congo, and I said that the war in DR Congo is currently as a result of the confrontation between the United States, the West, and the likes of Russia and China. And this has been supported by many African leaders and many, let me say, scholars have supported this my assumption. Many have argued that the current wars in most of the parts in Africa are, let me say, results of power balance. These powerful nations are trying to measure how much strength and influence they have in Africa. When I was talking about DR Congo, I did say that the United States is trying to fight the likes of Russia and China in the control of the resource-rich region, and that is true. Recently, the South African opposition leader, that is Julius Malema, was in Kenya, and when he was in Kenya, he gave a simple description of what is going on in DR Congo. According to Malema, he insisted that the likes of the United Kingdom, the likes of United States, the likes of Russia, China, and all those global nations are trying to flex their muscles in DR Congo. And most of the companies which are listed on the London Stock Exchange are operating in DR Congo behind the knowledge of DR Congolese citizens. I also gave a discussion and I engaged you in a given topic where I said that there is a silent genocide ongoing in Africa, and I compared the results of the war between Russia and Ukraine and the results of the war between Hamas and Israel. And I also gave snapshots on the results of the war in Sudan, the results of the war in DR Congo, the results of the war in Ethiopia, and the results of other wars in many African countries. When I gave this description, we found, and I clearly stated that the casualties from the wars in Africa are more than the casualties from the wars between Russia and Ukraine and between Hamas and Israel. I gave an example of DR Congo where I stated that the war in DR Congo has claimed more than 6 million lives. That was in 2010. By 2010, the war in DR Congo had claimed more than 6 million lives, and millions had also been displaced from their homes. When we compare with the war between Russia and Ukraine, the casualties are much less. I also gave an example of Sudan, and we found that the war in Sudan has claimed more lives than the war between Hamas and Israel. Yet, the likes of United States, the likes of United Kingdom, and the United Nations are silent about this silent genocide in Africa. Currently, and as of yesterday, there is a problem brewing up in Sudan. You all remember that Sudan has been at war since April 15th, when the leaders of Rapid Support Forces and the government forces collided, and there's been war in this country since April 15th this year. And according to most reports, this war has killed more than 10,000 people. And I want to say that thousands have also been displaced from this country. But when I was talking about the wars in Africa, you remember I referred to what the founding fathers said during the Addis Ababa conference in 1963. And the founding fathers, mainly Kwame Nkrumah, and sided with other founding fathers who attended the 1963 OAU summit in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. They described Africa, that Africa cannot grow independently, and they insisted that the growth of Africa depends on the growth of other parts of the world. And they also insisted that peace in Africa cannot be attained without peace in the whole of the world. And if Africa is to be peaceful, then the other parts of the world must also be peaceful. That is what the founding fathers said and insisted. The same emphasis was given by our present Pan-Africanists, and they did argue that Africa cannot be peaceful when one of Africa's countries or countries in Africa is at war. This means that the other parts of Africa cannot be peaceful when Sudan is at war, and the other parts of Africa cannot be at peace when Ethiopia is at war. The other parts of Africa cannot be at peace when Somalia is at war. And this is what is happening now in Africa. Sudan has been at war since April 15th, and I believe, and I hope you share my belief, that when Sudan is at war, its neighbors will also feel the after effects of this war. And when I talk about the neighbors of Sudan, I mean South Sudan, which is its immediate neighbor. I mean the likes of Central African Republic, the likes of DR Congo, the likes of Kenya, the likes of Ethiopia, and many other African countries. This is what is happening. And as of Sunday, there was a clash between the armies in Sudan and South Sudan. I don't believe it is a clash, but I believe that it is just as a result of the after effects of this war in Sudan. I insisted, and I continue to insist on this platform, that if African countries want to be peaceful, then they must ensure that there is peace in the whole of Africa. If South Sudan needs to be peaceful, then it must ensure that Sudan is peaceful. If Kenya is to be peaceful, then it must ensure that Somalia and its neighbors are peaceful. Without this, then I don't think there will be peace in Africa. And as I have always insisted, I insist again. The African Unity, that is what we call the Organization of African Unity, which is the body tasked with assessing the growth in Africa based on economics, politics, and social technology and others, must convene an immediate meeting. Let me not call it a meeting, but let me just call it a conference, a convention, must be convened immediately to discuss particularly And I want to be particular on this. This convention must be convened particularly with one primary agenda: to solve and end all wars in Africa. And if this is not done, then I believe that there will not be lasting peace will not be achieved in Africa. I also encourage the United Nations, and specifically the United Nations Security Council, to convene a meeting with one primary agenda: to end all wars in Africa. And when I talk about United Nations Security Council, this council has been convening meetings to discuss the likes of the wars currently ongoing between Hamas and Israel, the wars currently ongoing between Russia and Ukraine, and little concern is given to these African countries which are currently at war. I want to urge again the United Nations Security Council, and I want to urge the African Union, which is that is the UN of Africa, to convene a meeting to discuss an end to all wars in Africa. And if the likes of South Sudan, Kenya, Ethiopia, DR Congo, Central African Republic, and the rest, they want to attain peace, they must ensure that their neighbors are peaceful. If Kenya wants to be peaceful, then it must ensure that Somalia is peaceful. If Kenya needs to be peaceful, then it must ensure that Sudan is peaceful. So long as there will be war in Sudan, and so long as there will be war in Ethiopia, and so long as there will be war in Somalia, then Kenya will never know peace. That one you can take to the bank. So long as there will be war in Sudan, and so long as there will be war in Ethiopia, and so long as there will be war in, let me say, the likes of DR Congo and West Africa, Kenya and other parts of Africa which are currently peaceful will not know peace. The primary objective should be convening an immediate meeting to end all wars in Africa. And if this is done, then I want to say categorically and confidently that Africa will be peaceful.